Peanuts, or perhaps better known as its main character, Charlie Brown, in 3D from 2015, one of the few brands that has been content to stay in its time and not update itself to current moods, which somewhat ironically makes it timeless. From a 3D perspective, this would be easy to dismiss. It's generally shallow, sometimes reducing itself to a couple of cardboard layers. Where it does expand, the background is nearly always kept flat and the elements seem closer than what the perspective might suggest. That said, I think it's brilliant. This is done on purpose and with purpose, and maybe one of the most sophisticated uses of the stereo medium that I have seen yet. No, it's not a whiz-bang rock the theater experience, but you are watching a nuanced aesthetic. This isn't a clumsy throwaway accident, but craft. Now, Peanuts was a newspaper comic, and for those who are unfamiliar with the experience, before the internet, many families would buy a daily newspaper for about the price of a coffee. It was divided into various sections of categories of news, but most importantly, they always dedicated at least one page to comic strips. And on weekends, they were usually in color, and Peanuts was a mainstay of this page for decades. Maybe it still is. What set Peanuts apart was a long series of animated TV specials. The earliest of these, A Charlie Brown Christmas, and also It's the Great Pumpkin Charlie Brown, became yearly broadcast staples. The image of the world's most pathetic Christmas tree became a meme before memes were a meme. Ironic that a lesson in crass commercialism turned into a very hot commercial property. The 2015 movie brings that old newspaper comic experience to life. Not a big screen transformation, but a representation of what it actually felt like to read it. The movie itself is something of a greatest hits of Charlie Brown tropes that reoccurred throughout its comic book lifetime. They judiciously mimic the animation style of those old TV specials. The characters may be rendered in CGI, but they are presented as hand-drawn. They don't rotate at all, but rather cut between poses. The only shapes we see are ones that imitate something that has appeared in the comics as drawn by Schultz, the creator himself. There's a brief making of on the 2D disc that discusses this approach. As such, the Peanuts gang are always flat, but you can't really tell because they are shaded with depth. This, combined with a stereo background, gives a convincing illusion. If they had rendered these characters in real stereo, then I think their heads might be a bit too round, and the penciled-in hair and eyes would no longer blend into the figure. Peanuts is like an expressionist painting. It draws in symbols to convey its subjects. Notice on Snoopy in particular, the face is never really adjusted for perspective. If you look closely, you realize that his face is being painted on the side of his head. As action demands, you will have parts of their bodies show up in stereo, an arm or a leg that's extended. Remarkably, you'll get them interacting with stereo objects seamlessly. It never looks silly or out of place like you might find with, say, South Park. When Snoopy takes to the sky in his imaginary World War I drama, we get the most expansive and rich 3D moments of the movie. Everything is a CGI stereo except for the characters involved, and here we see the best example of the newspaper characters interacting with dimension. And really, I think most people would have no idea it's a mix of two worlds unless they took the time to examine the frames. I just want to mention here that this movie really blooms on a larger screen. I watched it at 55 inches and a 20-inch monitor, and the small screen obscured the stereo experience. Bigger is better with this one. Elsewhere in Peanuts Land, we play with the kids in the park. The distant background is generally flat, but we get some nice stereo-textured trees in between. And the landscape is in 3D, but again, and quite amazingly, they never look like paper dolls on it. It all blends right in. Inside their classroom is where I really felt the 3D became the most shallow. Everything felt just a little too close together, a bit claustrophobic, really. But then again, the smallness of the depth in the classroom speaks to the general smallness of being a kid. trapped in a classroom, and everything being near and immediate. Here, they also kind of bend the rules of the Peanuts world in that some of the kids should really be in different grades or even different schools, as they were in the comics. For Snoopy, they actually reused the voice from the 60s. The only other part that was voiced by an adult was his love interest, Fifi. In the 60s, they did try giving Snoopy an actual speaking voice with real dialogue in some TV spots. You can find them on YouTube, but it's just not Snoopy. Doesn't work at all. So Snoopy the dog here doesn't really talk, but he writes, and we see him collecting his thoughts at a typewriter. Anyone remember those? Here, the foreground is completely flat against the background. It's just a drawing. But once inspired and his thoughts are taken by imagination, we enter into a new world that is rich with 3D depth, much like our own inner life. Indeed, the writers point out that Snoopy is really Charlie Brown's alter ego, the self that he dreams of being. But we know dogs don't do that. We understand it's fantasy without being told. The thing about Peanuts is, through Charlie Brown, the fantasy always fails. Always. And it's okay. It's okay to be Charlie Brown. Imagine that. Today, those are fighting words. Now, does this bring Peanuts into the present day, or is it a sweet and loving goodbye to an era? I really couldn't decide, but I felt good watching. It was a happy time.